Hey everyone, it's Lexie. So in today's video I'll be sharing with you all the books that I ended up reading in the month of June. So June just flew by. I felt like I just had a lot of stuff going on, and when I was looking at all the books I read, I realized that there were kind of a good variety of books too in terms of genre, and 3 of these actually ended up being listened to via audiobook, which is a little bit different from what I normally do, but I had to do a lot of driving for Chesapeake Bay, driving out there, so it's roughly 7 hours there and 7 hours back. So I listened to some audiobooks, which helped kind of break up my ride a little bit, and it made it a lot of fun actually. Like, it actually made the ride go by a lot faster, which is really good. But overall it was a very good reading month. I'm looking at my bullet journal right now. I think, like, for the most part it was all 4 stars and above, and there was one that was 3 stars, which is still pretty good too. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So starting up, I first half read this, then listened to the audiobook for the last half for The Office BFFs by Jenna Fischer and Angela Kinsey, and I was so excited for this when I heard that they would be announcing this kind of a book that talks about their friendship, their time on The Office, and kind of them post office, and I really love this. I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. I think if you are a fan of their podcast, I think you'll really like this book, especially the audiobook, because it has some extra tidbits. So there's a foreword by Rainn Wilson, there's some kind of songs thrown in here by Reid, and some people also make like short little vocal cameos, which I really enjoyed. So I think if you're a fan of The Office and their podcast, I think you will like this. This is just like a delight. It was a delight to read. It was a delight to listen to. Like, there's so much behind the scenes, like pictures and just stories in here that I found just to be really fun. And as a fan of the show, it was interesting kind of learning about some of these things. And for me too, like, what I really liked about here is also they talked about life after The Office and how they found it like difficult to kind of advocate for themselves. So when they started this podcast, it was something that was very different for them, having to become like basically their own boss and say this is an advocate for themselves, what they think they're worth in terms of the podcast and what they actually want to accomplish, and kind of being their own boss for a change. And the stigma of women being in powerful positions are kind of seen as bossy, and how they've kind of overcome and tackle that and learn to stand up for themselves, which I really enjoyed. So yeah, like I said, I really like this. I got one of the signed copies too, which is really exciting. I don't have very many signed books, so yeah, this is just a delight. If you're a fan of The Office, I think you'll like this. And it's just tackling some of the like women issues. Like, I didn't know that if you have a baby when you're on a TV show, you get unpaid maternity leave, which is just crazy. But yeah, it's just nuts. But I learned so much. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, and I think if you're a fan of The Office, I think you'll really like this. I do recommend the audiobook just because I feel like, because this book is written kind of conversationally, so like Jenna has her account and then Angela will say her thing, and they kind of go back and forth with like different things. So that's why I said the audiobook works well, because it's kind of almost like a podcast where they account certain things. You can tell they get emotional talking about, you know, their friends and just the friendships that they formed when they were on The Office as well. So like I said, gave this 5 stars. I loved it. So next up I have, this is a book that my boyfriend gave me for Valentine's Day that I finally got around to reading, and it was mostly because I was rereading the Ursula and Isles series. So this one, as soon as I finished my reread, this was like the first full novel that I read after that reread, and it is The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, and I've heard really great things about this author. I think he also recommended The Dispossessed, I think by this one he said I would like as well, by this author. But this one is really interesting, and it kind of forced me to step outside my comfort zone, because it wasn't necessarily something that I would pick up for myself. And it follows an account of this human ambassador that is sent to this planet Winter, and in hopes that he wants to kind of spark trade between his country and this new planet here. And what is unique about this planet is that they are kind of fluid in terms of their gender. So the people that live on this planet go through like a cycle where they either, for that kind of phase, will be either become male or female for that thing. So gendered kind of stereotypes that humans have isn't really a thing here, because gender is fluid. Some person, like 1 month, can be very masculine and have be basically a male, but the next month they could identify as feminine. So there's a lot of fluidity in terms of gender, and I think this was written in the 60s, so I feel like it's 1969, so it's very much ahead of its times in terms of conversations about gender fluidity. And the aliens in here talk about how it is weird that the human from Earth, it kind of puts themselves in like gender boxes and they can't kind of escape from that, whereas here in winter they're able to be whatever they want to be. They're not held back by just because they identify as a female that month. Like, it doesn't throw off, like they're not less than just because they're women, which I thought is very interesting. And given all of the stuff going on now with current events, it's very, very interesting kind of seeing that. But yeah, I really like this. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. It's very much different than what I normally would have read, but I thought it provided a very interesting conversation on gender and how we kind of handle that as a society, and how we kind of lock ourselves into these, you know, discourses of gender, which I think is very interesting. But yeah, I like this. It made me step outside my comfort zone, because I don't really read a lot of sci-fi. But I did really like this, and yeah, I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. And I finished like the last like 100 pages or so when my boyfriend was getting surgery, because I drove him there while I was waiting. So it seems fitting that I read this while he was getting procedure done on his elbow. So yeah, like I said, I read like the last like half in one day. So yeah, overall, like I said, this made me step outside my comfort zone, and I'm very happy I did. So next we are moving on to the books that I read for, that's what I was looking at, like these last like 4 books were ones that I finished within a few days of each other, just because they were ones I was listening to Chesapeake Bay. I ended up finishing the last 50 pages in another, started another audiobook that I finished on the way back, and then I finished the other one within a day or two of getting back home. So yeah, despite it being a work conference, I did find a lot of time to kind of read during like my downtime, so that made it quite a bit of fun. So first up for the audiobook, I've always heard for this book, and it's very well loved, I think, on multiple book platforms on social media, is that the audiobook is the way to go for this, and I 100% agree, and I'm just obsessed with this book. And it is a Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and it basically is a hypothetical or fictionalized documentary of the band known as Daisy Jones and the Six, and it recounts the people that were actually there, their experience of how the band formed, how Daisy got in there, and basically the rise and fall of this band. And what is interesting too is that it is written in kind of like documentary narration, so it'll be like Billy says this, Daisy says this, and so it like kind of switches conversation. And from the audiobook standpoint, because it is a multi-cast audiobook, it really kind of brings you in, and I was just invested just with like the kind of rock culture from like the 70s, and yeah, all like trigger warnings for drug and alcohol abuse, just so you're aware. But yeah, I felt like this was like beautifully crafted and layered in terms of the how she was able to portray this narrative and who these characters were just through dialogue alone. And this audiobook like cast is fully stacked. Like, you would recognize a lot of the narrators in here, and one of the main ones for Billy, who is basically the head like singer for the band Six. He's like, I was like, why does his voice sound so familiar? And it is like, if you're familiar with Lador SVU and you recognize this character, I was like, oh my goodness, but I wondered why he sounded familiar. But yeah, this, like, I understand what all the hype is about for this book, and it is incredibly well deserved. I think I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars, but I feel like I'm leaning more towards a 5, just because even though I finished this audiobook like over a week ago, I still think about this book. Like, I was just, these characters felt so alive, and I was just invested in this story. And eventually you find out who this this like whoever is investigating like this story or who is documenting this story, like that twist like took me by surprise too. And I just like, I've never like felt about a book this way, like where I felt like it was real life. Like I felt like these events actually happened, and I believe this is actually going to be an Amazon Prime series, and I think that would just be so good, and has the actor who plays Finnick from the Hunger Games in there as one of the main characters, so I'm really excited for that. But yeah, like I said, this book I think is like my favorite book of the year. I think like that's how invested I was. I don't know why it took me so long to actually read this, but yeah, I'm happy I picked this up when I did. And if you can get the audiobook, I got mine from the library, I highly recommend you kind of read it in that form. Next up, we have the Tales and Teacups book club picks for the months of May and June, and I ended up finishing into this month, so I do apologize. It took me a while to get to this one, and it was The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, and this book was very haunting, and it recounts the story of a girl named Cora who is a slave in Georgia, and she's approached by one of the other slaves, and he wants to run away into the north with her. And what is interesting about this story is it takes the concept of the Underground Railroad and turns it on its head and actually makes it into this kind of mysterious, magical, actual train, which I thought was very interesting because as a kid, I learned about the Underground Railroad, I actually thought it was an actual train. So that's a very, very interesting, but this book was very powerful and moving. The author does not shy away from the horrors and brutality and just the overall just lack of lack of humanness that slavery was, in terms of like how you could treat another person like that. It was just terrible. I felt the kind of anxiety for these characters and the situations that they were put in, and yeah, like I just couldn't help to root for Cora and her kind of ability to persevere and push through and go through all this adversity for freedom. And although this is like a fictionalized story, you can tell that this like parts of her story must have happened throughout like the history of slavery, and it is just disgusting that people have done this, and I felt unsettled. Like I actually had to read this book in small doses because that is how upset I was reading these, and I was putting myself in these character situations, and it's just a very powerful read. I think this is a book that everyone needs to read once in their lifetime, and it was very impactful and powerful, and I think it's a very important book to read to see the kind of how slavery, even now, even though it's been abolished for over 100 years, there's still a lot of kind of the impact of slavery and racism is still so much interwoven into our like the fabric of our society, and I think this book kind of highlights that. My only complaint, I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. My only like criticism was that I did feel like there was some pacing issues, and although I was deeply attached to Cora's story and her experience, I felt like I was at arm's length with Cora the character. If I'm articulating that well, like I felt like I was at arm's length with Cora, even though I was very much invested in her experience. I felt Cora as the character was kind of, there was some distance between me and her story, like her character, but nevertheless I still feel like this book is very powerful and it is a very important read. So next up, on my way back from Chesapeake Bay, I was looking for an audiobook from a library that I could get, like an e-audiobook version, and something that I could finish within my drive. And so I just happened to find, I was like trying to visualize my bookshelves, and this is one that came to mind, and it is Taste by Stanley Tucci, and this is basically a food memoir. And it's funny too because me and my boyfriend have been just finished watching his CNN series where he goes to the different regions in Italy and looks up and like kind of talks about the history, the agriculture, and the how all these things combine to create the food that these regions are most known for. Just basically how culturally tied the foods are in Italy with the different regions. And yeah, so I got this book I think over Christmas or during the holidays, and I just never picked it up. But I think the audiobook, again, because it is Stanley Tucci narrating it, it made it a lot of fun, and there's some recipes thrown in here, and like when he was describing certain foods, like I was getting like hungry thinking about it. And yeah, like they would have like the recipes in here, and yeah, I just thought it was really interesting just how closely tied he is with food. Like I felt that was very interesting. I do apologize, our phone is ringing. We've been getting a lot of spam calls, so I do apologize for that. Alrighty, I'm back. But yeah, so I thought it was really interesting. Like, you've heard of memoirs, but it's interesting that it's like a food memoir talking about like his childhood growing up and like the foods he would eat, and you know how he eventually became someone who is like a big like foodie basically. And I thought that was really, really interesting, and it kind of talks about how food and like different foods tie you to kind of your ancestry. So it's like he's like, my, you know, grandkids will not know my mom, but they'll know her through her like this recipe, which I thought was a very interesting way to kind of look at food and kind of the kind of familial connections that different foods and recipes can kind of have within, you know, families, which I thought was interesting. And like the last chapter here goes into how he had tongue cancer and his experience with not, like, literally not being able to eat anything. He had a stomach tube for feeding, and just his experience there, which I did not know about him, which I thought was very interesting, and how he now is just so thankful that he can actually taste things, because I think it's very common for people who go through radiation for tongue cancer can't taste a lot of things. So I found that to be very interesting. So I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. Because it was the audiobook, I think that also made it kind of fun too, because he's the one narrating it as well. But yeah, I think if you are a foodie and if you're a fan of Stanley Tucci, I think this is a very, you know, interesting memoir to read. And lastly, this is a book that I finished actually a couple days ago, and this is one that my boyfriend recommended to me. He read this one and he was like, oh, I think you would really like this. So I was really excited. The premise just sounded super interesting and right up my alley, and I'm very happy I tried this because it introduced me to a new author that I've never read anything from, and it is Nettle and Bone by Kingfischer, and this is kind of like a fairy tale fantasy-esque story. So we follow Mara, who is the youngest of 3 sisters, and she is a princess, and she is kind of sent to a convent to kind of live out her life by her mother, the queen. And so when she finds out that the prince that her sister is married to is abusing her, she decides that she wants to kill the prince. So she goes on kind of this like fantastical quest to gather the things and eventually the people that she needs in order to complete this task. And what I like too is that this is a standalone fantasy, and it is also very, very short. I believe it's under 250 pages, so it is a very quick read, but this one was just a lot of fun. Like, I haven't really read anything kind of like a fairy tale-esque type thing, and this one was very dark and grim as well, and I liked that, like that combination of kind of fantasy elements with like godmothers and different types of magics and all that stuff, and combining it into kind of this dark kind of feminist quest as well in terms of dealing with abusive partners, which I thought was very, very interesting. Yeah, and I really liked it. It was a lot of fun because it is very short. You don't get a lot of kind of world development, but this is very much character driven, which I really enjoyed. I like seeing Mara kind of grow throughout this book in terms of, you know, not kind of hiding in the shadows, being who she wants to be, not being afraid to kind of show herself to everyone and stand up for her sister, and, you know, kind of fix that relationship there, which I really enjoyed. So if you're looking for something a little bit different in terms of a quick standalone kind of fairy tale-esque fantasy, then I feel like this one would be a lot of fun. Like I said, I've never really read anything like this, and I'm glad my boyfriend recommended it to me because I really enjoyed it. So overall, I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. So that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below some of the books that you read this month and all of that fun stuff. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and I will see you guys next time. Bye, guys.